The mess hall of the Galactic Coalition battleship Nexus Prime buzzed with the low hum of different alien voices. Captain Jake Morrison sat at the far end of a long metal table, quietly eating his meal while listening to his fellow soldiers share stories from their homeworlds. The human officer looked small compared to the massive alien warriors around him, but his eyes held a calm confidence that few noticed. Lieutenant Vextai, a towering reptilian saurian with scales that shifted from green to brown depending on his mood, was telling a story about the great hunters of his world. His voice carried the pride of his species as he described warriors who could track prey across entire continents using only their enhanced senses. The great hunter Sasktal once followed a shadow beast for 3 full seasons, Vextai said, his forked tongue flicking out as he spoke. The creature had killed dozens of our people and vanished into the deep marshes. But Sasktal never gave up. He could smell the beast's fear from 100 miles away. When he finally cornered it, the battle lasted 7 days and 7 nights. The other soldiers nodded with respect. Commander Zarelin, an elegant 4-armed Celestian with skin that seemed to glow with inner light, spoke next. Her voice was musical, like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. The warriors of my people had even greater gifts, she said, her 4 hands moving gracefully as she spoke. They could manipulate gravitational fields with pure mental focus. During the War of the Falling Stars, Commander Veltar lifted an entire enemy fleet and threw it into our sun. The battle was over in minutes. More nods of approval came from around the table. These stories were well known throughout the Coalition. Every species had legends of great warriors who had performed impossible feats. The Corvani could phase through solid matter. The Druxi could control time itself for brief moments. Each race had evolved abilities that seemed magical to other species. Captain Morrison continued eating, saying nothing. He had heard these stories many times before. After 3 months aboard the Nexus Prime, he knew all the favorite tales of his crewmates. But he also knew they were just getting started. What about the Zentari? Asked Corporal Kresh, a stocky warrior with thick gray skin and 6 arms. Tell us about the Mind Warriors. Zarelin smiled. Ah yes, the Zentari. Their greatest champion. Could read the thoughts of enemies from across star systems. He won the Battle of the Crimson Nebula without firing a single shot. He simply made the enemy fleet believe they were already defeated. The stories continued for another hour. Each species had legends that seemed impossible, but all were accepted as historical fact. The Coalition had detailed records of these great warriors. They had studied their abilities, tried to understand how they worked, and used this knowledge to build better military strategies. Finally, Vextai turned to Jake Morrison. The human had been quiet through the entire meal, and the Saurian's curiosity was getting the better of him. What about humans, Captain? Vextai asked. Surely your people have legends of great warriors too? Jake looked up from his meal. He had been expecting this question. It came up every few weeks when new soldiers joined the crew or when the conversation turned to ancient heroes. He set down his fork and thought for a moment. We have a few stories, he said quietly. There was a warrior named Achilles who could not be killed in battle. He fought in a great war and defeated hundreds of enemies. No weapon could harm him except in one small spot on his heel. The table fell silent for a moment, then Vextai started laughing. It was a harsh, barking sound that echoed through the mess hall. No weapon could harm him? The Saurian said between laughs. That's impossible. Every species has physical limits. Even the strongest armor can be broken. Wait, there's more, Jake continued. We had another hero named Hercules who was so strong he could lift mountains. He killed a lion with his bare hands and cleaned out stables by diverting rivers. Now Zarelin was laughing too. Her musical voice made the laughter sound like bells. Ringing lift mountains? She said, even our gravity manipulators can't do that? And killing a lion with bare hands? Humans are one of the weakest species in the Coalition. Your bone density is too low, your muscle mass too small. Jake nodded. Then there was Beowulf. He fought monsters that terrorized entire kingdoms. He could swim in full armor for days without stopping. He tore the arm off a creature that no weapon could cut. By now, half the mess hall was listening and laughing. The idea of humans having such powerful legends was amusing to everyone. Humans were known throughout the coalition as clever and brave, but physically weak. They had joined the galactic community only 50 years ago and were still considered newcomers. "Your people must be natural storytellers," said Corporal Crush, wiping tears from his 6 eyes. "Since your reality is so boring, you had to make up exciting stories." "Human legends sound like children's bedtime stories," added Zarlin. "Compared to the verified historical accounts of other species, they seem like pure fantasy." The laughter continued for several more minutes. Jake took it all in stride, but there was something in his eyes that none of the aliens noticed. It was not embarrassment or anger. It was a quiet knowledge, as if he understood something they did not. "We do tell a lot of stories," Jake said finally. "Humans have always been good at that, especially the true ones." "True ones?" Vextai asked, still chuckling. "You mean humans actually believe these impossible tales?" "Every human culture has similar stories," Jake replied. Warriors who could fight impossible odds, heroes who performed superhuman feats, defenders who could defeat monsters that terrorized entire populations. The names change, but the stories are always the same. "That proves they're made up," said Zarlin. "If they were real, they would be different in each culture. Real events don't repeat themselves exactly." Jake smiled. It was a small, quiet smile that didn't reach his eyes. Maybe there's another explanation, such as..." Vextai asked. "Maybe humans have always been capable of things that other species find impossible," Jake said. "Maybe our stories aren't exaggerations. Maybe they're just records of what humans do when they have to." The laughter died down, but the alien soldiers still looked amused. The idea that humans had hidden abilities was ridiculous. Human military records showed they were average soldiers at best. They followed orders well and were brave enough, but they had no special powers. They couldn't lift mountains or survive impossible wounds or fight monsters with their bare hands. "Captain Morrison," said Vextai, trying to be kind, "humans have been part of the coalition for 50 years. We've seen how your people fight. You're good soldiers, but you're not legendary warriors." "Coalition training is different from human fighting," Jake said. "We follow your rules, use your tactics, fight your way. It works well enough." "Are you saying humans fight differently when they're alone?" Zarlin asked. Jake finished his meal and stood up. "I'm saying that humans have always been good at adapting to their environment. When the environment changes, so do humans." He picked up his tray and walked toward the disposal unit. The alien soldiers watched him go, still chuckling among themselves. The idea that humans had legendary abilities was the funniest thing they had heard all week. But Jake Morrison knew something they didn't. He knew that in a few days they would receive a mission that would test everything they believed about human limitations. He knew that when the time came, his people would show the galaxy what human legends really meant. As he left the mess hall, Jake could still hear the laughter behind him. Soon, he thought, they would understand that human stories weren't fantasies. They were warnings. The alarm bells rang through the Nexus Prime at 0300 hours, jolting everyone from their sleep. Captain Jake Morrison was already awake, standing in front of the large viewing window in his quarters, watching the stars. Something had felt wrong. For the past hour, though he couldn't explain why, within minutes, all senior officers were called to the bridge. Jake arrived to find Admiral Corvaz, a massive 8-foot-tall draconian with bronze scales, studying holographic displays that showed star charts and tactical information. The Admiral's reptilian face was grim. "We have received a distress signal from the mining colony of Kepler 442b, Admiral Corvaz announced. His voice was deep and gravelly, like rocks grinding together. "The void swarm has overwhelmed the planets. Defenses, over 50,000 civilians are trapped in underground shelters." Jake studied the tactical display. The planet was a hostile world covered in crystalline formations that jutted from the surface like broken glass. The mining colony had been built deep underground to avoid the constant electrical storms that raged across the planet's surface. "What's the situation?" asked Commander Zarelin, her forearms crossing as she examined the data. "The colony's shields are powered by geothermal generators," Admiral Korvas explained. "The Void Swarm has damaged the main power lines. The shields will fail within 6 hours. After that, the creatures will break through and kill everyone inside." Lieutenant Vextai stepped forward. "How many enemy forces are we facing?" "Intelligence reports indicate over 10,000 warrior-class void creatures," the Admiral replied. "They have completely surrounded the colony. Standard orbital bombardment is impossible because the civilians are too close to the enemy positions." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. The Void Swarm was unlike any enemy the Coalition had faced before. The creatures seemed to absorb light itself, making them hard to see and even harder to kill. They moved fast, hit hard, and showed no fear of death. Worse, they seemed to learn from each battle, adapting their tactics to counter whatever the Coalition threw at them. "What about evacuation?" asked Corporal Kresh, his 6 arms fidgeting nervously. "The planet's surface is covered in crystal formations that interfere with our sensors and communications," Admiral Kovas said. "The underground tunnels are unstable and could collapse at any moment. Standard evacuation procedures won't work." The bridge fell silent. Everyone knew what this meant. The mission was impossible. No small team could fight through 10,000 void creatures and evacuate 50,000 civilians in 6 hours. The terrain was too hostile, the enemy too numerous, and the time too short. "We could try a full fleet assault," suggested Commander Zarelin. "Overwhelm them with numbers." "The main fleet is 3 days away," Admiral Korvas replied. "And even if they were here, a full assault would likely cause the underground shelters to collapse. We would kill the people we're trying to save." Jake stepped forward. "I volunteered to lead a strike team." The bridge erupted in surprised voices. Lieutenant Vextai looked at the human captain as if he had lost his mind. "Captain Morrison, with respect, this is suicide," Vextai said. "The combat ratings show that humans have the lowest physical capabilities in the Coalition military. You would be sending your team to their deaths." "The psychological profiles indicate that humans are too emotionally driven," added Zarelin. "In a crisis situation, that becomes a liability, not an asset." Admiral Kovas studied Jake carefully. The human officer was calm, his posture relaxed, but his eyes held a determination that was unmistakable. "What do you propose, Captain?" The Admiral asked. Jake moved to the tactical display and began studying the terrain maps. His fingers moved across the holographic surface, highlighting paths through the crystal formations and marking potential entry points to the underground tunnels. "The crystal formations interfere with sensors, but they also provide cover," Jake said. "A small team could move through them without being detected by the main void forces. The underground tunnels are unstable, but they're also defensible. We could use controlled explosions to create choke points." "You're talking about fighting 10,000 creatures with a handful of soldiers," Vextai protested. "It's impossible." "Not fighting them," Jake corrected. "Avoiding them. We don't need to defeat the entire swarm. We just need to reach the civilians and get them out." Jake continued analyzing the data. He had already identified the best insertion points, the most stable tunnel routes, and the optimal extraction zones. His mind was working through scenarios and contingencies faster than the bridge computers. "I'll need specific team members," Jake said. "Pete Collins for demolitions, Lisa Barnes for precision shooting, Danny Rodriguez for medical support, and Amy Foster for communications." Admiral Kovas checked the crew roster. "All humans, yes, sir." "Captain, your plan has less than a 5% chance of success," said Commander Zarelin. "And that's being generous." Jake looked at her with those calm, steady eyes. "What's the chance of success if we do nothing?" The question hung in the air. Everyone knew the answer. If they didn't act, 50,000 people would die in 6 hours. The Coalition would lose an entire colony and all the rare minerals it produced. The Void Swarm would grow stronger and more confident. The terrain analysis shows that the crystal formations create acoustic dead zones, Jake continued. Standard military communications won't work. We'll be cut off from support once we land. That makes the mission even more impossible, Vextai said. It also means we'll be operating independently, Jake replied. No outside interference, no conflicting orders, no backup plans to fall back on. We succeed or we fail based on our own abilities. Admiral Kovaz was quiet for a long moment. The Draconian had fought in a dozen wars and commanded fleets in battles across the galaxy. He had seen brave soldiers and skilled tacticians. But there was something different about the human captain. Something that reminded him of the old stories. The legends of warriors who could achieve the impossible. You realize that if you fail, we'll lose not just the colony, but also your entire team, the Admiral said. Yes, sir. And you understand that once you land, you'll be on your own. We won't be able to provide air support or reinforcements. Yes, sir. Then why are you volunteering for this mission, Captain? Jake was quiet for a moment. He looked at the tactical display, at the images of the crystal-covered planet where 50,000 people waited to die. When he spoke, his voice was steady and sure. Because someone has to try. And because sometimes impossible missions aren't as impossible as they seem, Admiral Korvas made his decision. Very well, Captain. You have 6 hours to prepare your team and launch. May the stars watch over you. As the meeting broke up, the alien officers talked among themselves in hushed tones. They were already planning memorial services for the human strike team. The mission was noble, but it was also hopeless. 5 humans against 10,000 void creatures on a hostile planet. With no support and no backup plan, Lieutenant Vextai approached Jake as he was leaving the bridge. Captain, I respect your courage, but this is suicide. Your team will be remembered as heroes, but you'll still be dead. Jake stopped and looked at the Saurian. Maybe you'll learn something about human capabilities that your psychological profiles don't cover, such as what humans can do when everything depends on them succeeding. Jake left the bridge and headed toward the shuttle bay. He had 4 hours to brief his team and prepare for the most dangerous mission of his career. As he walked through the corridors, he passed alien soldiers who looked at him with a mixture of respect and pity. They admired his courage, but thought he was walking to his death. Jake Morrison knew better. He knew that in a few hours his team would show the galaxy what human legends really meant. The impossible mission was about to become possible. The shuttle dropped through the atmosphere of Kepler 442 be like a stone falling into hell. Captain Jake Morrison sat in the pilot's seat, his hands steady on the controls as lightning crashed around them. The planet's surface was a maze of crystal, formations that stretched as far as the eye could see, each one crackling with electrical energy. Communications are down, reported Amy Foster from the back of the shuttle. The young woman's voice was calm despite the chaos around them. The crystal interference is worse than we expected. Sensors are useless too, added Pete Collins, checking his equipment. We're flying blind. Jake didn't seem worried. He guided the shuttle through the crystal maze with an ease that defied explanation. Every turn, every dive, every climb seemed perfectly timed. Lightning struck the crystals around them, but somehow never hit their craft. How are you doing that? Asked Lisa Barnes, the team's sniper. She was watching Jake pilot the shuttle with movements that seemed almost like a dance. Just following the path, Jake replied quietly. What path? I don't see any path. Jake didn't answer. He was too focused on something the others couldn't see. The shuttle wove through the crystal formations like it was following an invisible road. Behind them, the monitoring station on the Nexus Prime had lost all contact. As far as the alien, Command knew the human team had vanished into the electrical storms. The shuttle touched down in a small clearing surrounded by towering crystal spires. As soon as they landed, Jake could see the problem. The air itself seemed to writhe with dark shapes. The void swarm was everywhere. Holy hell, whispered Danny Rodriguez, the team medic. There are hundreds of them just in this area. The void creatures looked like living shadows. They moved without sound, their forms shifting and changing like smoke. Some were the size of dogs, others as large as vehicles. All of them had the same hungry, empty eyes that seemed to absorb light. Remember, we're not here to fight the whole swarm, Jake said, checking his weapon. We find the civilians, get them out, and go home. Right, Pete said, loading his demolition pack. Simple. They moved out of the shuttle and into the crystal maze. Within minutes, Jake's team discovered that their equipment was almost useless. The crystals interfered with their sensors, their communications, and even their weapon targeting systems. They were essentially fighting with basic gear. And their own skills? That's when the impossible began to happen. Jake didn't just move through the crystal formations. He flowed through them like water. Every step was perfectly placed, every turn precisely timed. When a group of void creatures appeared ahead, Jake didn't retreat or call for backup. He simply changed direction, leading his team along a path that somehow avoided the enemies entirely. How did you know they were there? Lisa asked after they had passed a cluster of sleeping void creatures. I could smell them, Jake replied. Smell them? From 100 yards away? Jake nodded. They smell like old metal and burnt ozone. You'll learn to recognize it. Pete Collins was having his own revelations. When they reached a collapsed tunnel that blocked their path, he didn't just clear the rubble. He studied the crystal formations. Around them, ran his hands over the walls, and then placed his explosive charges in positions that made no sense according to standard demolition procedures. That's not how you're supposed to do it, Danny said, watching Pete work. Standard procedures don't work here, Pete replied. The crystals have their own internal structure. You have to work with them, not against them. When Pete detonated his charges, the explosion didn't just clear the tunnel. It created a new passage that was wider, more stable, and perfectly aligned with their destination. The crystal formations had been reshaped rather than destroyed, forming natural supports that would hold for years. That's impossible, Amy said, staring at the new tunnel. You can't predict how crystals will break. I didn't predict it, Pete said. I just asked them nicely. Lisa Barnes was discovering her own capabilities. When they encountered their first group of void creatures that couldn't be avoided, she didn't just shoot them. She became something else entirely. Her first shot passed through 3 crystal formations, ricocheted off 2 metal surfaces, and struck a void creature that none of them could see. The bullet had traveled over 200 yards through a maze of obstacles to hit a target that was completely hidden. Lucky shot, Danny muttered. Her second shot was even more impressive. It bounced off 5 different surfaces, split into fragments when it hit a crystal edge, and the fragments struck 3 different void creatures simultaneously. All 3 enemies died instantly. That's not luck, Amy said quietly. That's something else. Lisa was as surprised as anyone. I can see the path, she said. I can see exactly where the bullet needs to go, what it needs to hit, how it needs to bounce. It's like the crystals are showing me. Danny Rodriguez was having his own amazing experience. When Pete was injured by falling crystal debris, Danny didn't just treat the wound. He seemed to understand the injury at a level that went beyond medical training. Your left leg is fractured in 3 places, Danny said, running his hands over Pete's leg without looking at it. The bone fragments are pressing against a nerve cluster. There's internal bleeding, but it's slow. You also have a concussion from the impact. How can you tell all that just by touching? Pete asked. I can feel it, Danny replied. Your body is telling me what's wrong. Danny's treatment was unlike anything in standard medical procedures. He used pressure points that shouldn't have existed, manipulated bones and muscles in ways that defied anatomy textbooks, and somehow stopped internal bleeding without surgery or medication. You should be unconscious from pain, Danny said as he finished working, but you're not. Your body is producing its own painkillers. How is that possible? Human bodies are capable of more than we usually ask of them, Danny replied. Sometimes they just need permission to do what they're designed to do. Amy Foster was making her own discoveries. Despite the crystal interference that had cut off all communication with the ship, she was somehow maintaining contact with the team. More than that, She was coordinating their movements with a precision that seemed telepathic. "Jake, there's a patrol coming from your left," she said into her communicator. 30 seconds. "How can you know that?" Jake asked. "You're 200 yards away?" "I can hear them," Amy replied. "The crystals carry sound in strange ways. If you listen carefully, you can hear everything that's happening in the whole area." "That's impossible." "The crystals should dampen sound, not amplify it. They do both," Amy said. "You just have to know how to listen." As the mission continued, the alien forces monitoring from orbit were receiving impossible reports. The human team's equipment was still offline, but somehow they were moving through the crystal maze faster than any computer had predicted. They were avoiding enemy patrols that should have been impossible to detect. They were clearing obstacles that should have taken hours of work. Admiral Corvas stood on the bridge of the Nexus Prime, watching the tactical display with growing amazement. The human team had been on the planet for 3 hours and had somehow made it halfway to the civilian shelters. According to every computer model, they should have been dead within the first hour. "How are they doing this?" Lieutenant Vextai asked. "I don't know," Admiral Corvas replied, "but I'm beginning to think we've underestimated human capabilities." On the planet's surface, Jake Morrison and his team were learning something that would change everything. They weren't just performing beyond their limitations. They were discovering that they had never known what their real limitations were. The legends weren't myths. They were memories of what humans could become when everything depended on them succeeding. The evacuation shuttles lifted off from Kepler 442 just as the planet's shields failed completely. Captain Jake Morrison watched through the rear viewport as void creatures swarmed over the abandoned mining colony. His team had done the impossible. They had rescued all 50,000 civilians in under 6 hours. The return journey to the Nexus Prime was quiet. Pete Collins sat with his arm in a sling, still amazed that he could walk after the injuries he had sustained. Lisa Barnes was cleaning her rifle, but her hands shook slightly as she remembered the shots she had made. Danny Rodriguez was checking the medical supplies, wondering how he had treated injuries that should have been fatal. Amy Foster stared out the window, still hearing echoes of sounds that shouldn't have been possible. Jake piloted the shuttle with the same calm confidence he had shown throughout the mission. But now his team was looking at him differently. They had all felt something change during the battle. They had all done things that their training said were impossible. "Captain," Pete said finally, "what happened down there?" Jake was quiet for a long moment. "What do you mean?" "You know what I mean? The things we did, the way we fought, the abilities we showed. That wasn't normal human performance." "Define normal," Jake replied when they docked with the Nexus Prime. Word of their success had already spread throughout the ship. The alien crew members lined the corridors, watching the human team with a mixture of respect and confusion. 50,000 people had been saved by 5 humans in a mission that every computer model said was impossible. Admiral Corvas was waiting for them in the shuttle bay. The massive Draconian's bronze scales seemed to glow with approval as he watched. The civilians being processed by medical teams. "Outstanding work, Captain," the Admiral said. "The Coalition owes you a debt that can never be repaid." "Just doing our job, sir," Jake replied. "No," Admiral Corvas said firmly. "What you did was far beyond any job description. I've been a military commander for over a century. I've seen courage, skill, and dedication. But what you accomplished defies every tactical principle I know." The debriefing took place in the main conference room. Jake and his team sat at one end of the long table while Admiral Corvas, Commander Zarelin, Lieutenant Vextai, and other senior officers sat at the other end. The holographic displays showed the mission timeline, but the data raised more questions than answers. "According to our sensors, you moved through the crystal maze at speeds that should have been impossible," Commander Zarelin said. "The terrain analysis showed that the path you took didn't exist. We found a way," Jake said simply. "The demolition work was equally impossible," added Lieutenant Vextai. "Specialist Collins somehow reshaped crystal formations that should have Taken industrial equipment to move. Pete shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The crystals just needed to be asked nervously. That's not how physics works, Vextai protested. Maybe your physics don't work the same way as ours, Pete replied. The questions continued for an hour. How had Lisa Barnes made shots that required impossible calculations? How had Danny Rodriguez treated injuries without proper medical equipment? How had Amy Foster maintained communications through crystal interference that should have been impenetrable? Each question was met with simple answers that explained nothing. The humans had done what needed to be done. They had found a way. They had adapted to the situation. Finally, Lieutenant Vextai stood up. The tall Saurian was clearly frustrated. This is ridiculous, he said. You're telling us that 5 humans, using basic equipment and minimal support, accomplished what our best computer models said would require a full battalion. Either you're lying about what happened or you're lying about what humans are capable of. Jake Morrison stood up as well. The human captain was half the size of the Saurian, but somehow he didn't look small. He looked calm, confident, and completely unimpressed by the alien's anger. Neither, Jake said. We're telling you the truth about what happened, and now I'm going to tell you the truth about what humans are capable of. The room fell silent. Every alien in the conference room was watching the human captain with intense attention. Human myths aren't exaggerations, Jake said. They're historical records. What do you mean? Asked Admiral Kovaz. Every human culture has stories of heroes performing impossible feats because humans have always been capable of impossible feats. The difference is that most species evolved in environments that rewarded cooperation and specialization. Humans evolved in an environment that demanded individual excellence under extreme pressure. Jake walked to the holographic display and called up images of Earth. The planet appeared in the center of the room, slowly rotating to show its diverse and dangerous landscapes. Earth wasn't just a world, Jake continued. It was a crucible. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans survived ice ages, natural disasters, predators, diseases, and constant warfare. We didn't just survive, we thrived. We developed abilities that other species consider supernatural. That's impossible, Commander Zarlin said. Evolution doesn't work that way. You can't develop abilities that violate physical laws. We didn't violate physical laws, Jake replied. We learned to use them in ways that other species never needed to. When your people developed gravity manipulation, they did it through technology and genetic enhancement. When humans needed to manipulate their environment, they did it through pure adaptation and will. Jake gestured to his team. What you saw on Kepler 442b wasn't superhuman performance. It was normal human potential. Under extreme conditions. The reason our myths sound impossible is that they describe what humans become when everything depends on individual performance. You're saying that the stories about Achilles, Hercules, and Beowulf are real? Vextai asked. I'm saying that. Those stories describe normal human capabilities under extreme stress. Achilles wasn't invulnerable because of magic. He was invulnerable because he had trained his mind and body to perform at levels that seem impossible to other species. Hercules didn't have supernatural strength. He had learned to use his entire body as a weapon in ways that other species never needed to develop. Danny Rodriguez spoke up. On the planet, I could feel injuries that I couldn't see. I could manipulate bones and muscles in ways that aren't taught in any medical school, but it didn't feel supernatural. It felt like I was finally using abilities that had always been there. The same for me, added Lisa Barnes. Those impossible shots weren't luck or magic. I could see the path the bullets needed to take. I could calculate trajectories that our computers said were impossible. But it felt natural, like I was doing something I had always known how to do. Pete Collins nodded. The crystals weren't just rocks to me. They were like living things with their own structure and logic. I could feel how they wanted to move, how they needed to be shaped. It was like having a conversation with the planet itself. Amy Foster was the last to speak. I could hear everything happening across the entire area. The crystals weren't interfering with communication. They were enhancing it if you knew how to listen. It was like the whole planet was talking to me. Admiral Kovas was quiet for a long moment. The ancient Draconian had seen many species and fought in countless battles. But he had never encountered anything like this. "You're telling us that humans have been holding back," he said finally. "Not holding back," Jake corrected. "Being held back. Coalition military training teaches us to follow standardized procedures, to rely on technology, to work within established parameters. All of that prevents humans from accessing their full potential." "And what is your full potential?" asked the Commander Zara Lin. Jake smiled. It was the same quiet smile he had worn in the mess hall when his crewmates had laughed at human legends. "We're still finding out," he said, "but I think you're going to be surprised." The conference room was completely silent. The alien officers were trying to process what they had heard. If Jake was telling the truth, then everything they knew about human capabilities was wrong. The weakest species in the coalition might actually be the strongest. "This changes everything," Admiral Kovas said finally. "Yes," Jake replied. "It does." 6 months after the Kepler 442b mission, the war against the Void Swarm had changed completely. Admiral Kovas stood on the bridge of the Nexus Prime, watching reports flow in from across the galaxy. Every display showed the same impossible pattern. Human strike teams were winning battles that should have been unwinnable. The transformation had started slowly. After Jake Morrison's revelation about human capabilities, the Coalition Command had begun experimenting with new tactics. Instead of trying to make humans fit into alien military doctrine, they started developing strategies that used human legendary potential. The results were devastating to the Void Swarm. Human strike teams were now deployed as independent operators, given impossible missions with minimal support. They were sent to retake planets that had been written off as lost. They were assigned to destroy enemy strongholds that had withstood months of conventional assault. They were tasked with rescuing civilians from situations that no computer model said were survivable, and they succeeded. Every single time. Captain Jake Morrison had become something of a legend himself. His team was now called the Phantom Squad, and stories of their missions spread through the Coalition fleet like wildfire. They had retaken the fortress world of Sigma 7 by walking through walls that should have been impenetrable. They had destroyed an entire Void Swarm fleet by sabotaging their mothership from the inside. They had rescued 10,000 prisoners from a planet that was supposedly uninhabitable, but Jake's team wasn't unique anymore. Human soldiers throughout the Coalition were discovering abilities they never knew they possessed. When freed from standard military protocols and given missions that demanded individual excellence, they performed feats that other species called miraculous. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell had led a team of 12 humans against a Void Swarm army of 50,000. The battle had lasted 3 days, and when it was over, the human team had won. Sarah herself had fought for 18 hours straight without rest. Moving through the battlefield like a force of nature, Major Robert Lee had single-handedly held a bridge against a Void Swarm assault, while civilians evacuated behind him. For 6 hours he had faced wave after wave of enemies, using weapons, improvised explosives, and eventually his bare hands. When reinforcements arrived, they found him standing in a pile of destroyed void creatures, still ready to fight. Captain Maria Santos had guided her team through a minefield that should have killed them all, but she had somehow sensed the location of every explosive device, leading her soldiers safely through terrain that their instruments said was impossible to navigate. The stories went on and on. Humans were performing legendary feats across the galaxy, and the Void Swarm was beginning to retreat. The creatures that had once seemed unstoppable were now avoiding human forces whenever possible. On the bridge of the Nexus Prime, Commander Zaralin approached Admiral Korvas with the latest battle reports. "The Void Swarm has abandoned the Centauri sector," she reported. "They're pulling back to defensive positions in the Outer Rim." "How many human teams were involved in the Centauri campaign?" Admiral Korvas asked. 15 teams. Total personnel, 93 humans. The Admiral was quiet for a moment. The Centauri sector had been under Void Swarm control for over a year. Coalition forces had tried to retake it 6 times with armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands. 93 humans had succeeded where massive fleets had failed. The other species are asking questions, Zarlin continued. They want to know why humans are suddenly so effective. Some of them are requesting human advisors for their own forces. And what do the humans say? That they're just doing what humans have always done. They're adapting to the situation. Admiral. Kovas nodded. He had been studying human history since the Kepler 442b mission, trying to understand what Jake Morrison had told them. The more he learned, the more he realized that humans had been hiding their true nature for 50 years. Every human culture had legends of heroes who could perform impossible feats. But they also had something else. They had stories of ordinary people who became heroes when circumstances demanded it. Mothers who lifted vehicles to save their children. Soldiers who fought impossible odds to protect their comrades. Civilians who walked through fire to rescue strangers. The Admiral had come to understand that human legends weren't about superhuman individuals. They were about the superhuman potential that existed in every human being. Lieutenant Vextai joined them. On the bridge. The Saurian had been assigned to study human tactics and develop new training programs based on their methods. I've been working with the human instructors, Vextai reported. They're teaching us things that aren't in any military manual, such as? They call it situational adaptation. Instead of following predetermined strategies, they teach soldiers to read the battlefield and respond to what they find there. They don't plan for every possibility. They develop the ability to handle any possibility. That sounds like chaos, Zarlin said. That's what I thought too, Vextai replied. But it works. The human instructors can look at a tactical situation and immediately see solutions that our computers miss. They don't think in terms of what's possible or impossible. They think in terms of what needs to be done. Admiral Kovas walked to the viewing window and looked out at the stars. Somewhere in the darkness, the Void Swarm was regrouping and planning their next move. But for the first time since the war had begun, he felt confident about the Coalition's chances. Have you spoken with Captain Morrison recently? He asked. Yes, sir, Vextai replied. He's training a new group of human recruits. He says they're learning faster than any previous class. Why do you think that is? Because they're not being taught to fight like other species. They're being taught to fight like humans. The conversation was interrupted by an urgent communication from the communications center. A new distress signal had been received from the colony world of New Geneva. The Void Swarm had launched a surprise attack and overwhelmed the planet's defenses. Over 200,000 civilians were trapped. 6 months ago, this would have been considered a catastrophic loss. The Coalition would have written off the planet and focused on preventing the Void Swarm from spreading further. But now, Admiral Kovas had another option. Contact Captain Morrison, he ordered. Tell him we have a new mission for his team. Within an hour, Jake Morrison was on the bridge receiving his briefing. The situation was even worse than Kepler 442b had been. More enemies, more civilians, more hostile terrain. The mission was impossible by any reasonable standard. How many teams do you need? Admiral Kovas asked. Just mine, Jake replied. But I'd like to bring some of the new recruits. They need field experience. Captain, there are over 50,000 void creatures on that planet. Your team would be outnumbered 10,000 to 1. Jake smiled. It was the same quiet smile he had worn in the mess hall when his crewmates had laughed at human legends. The same smile he had worn when he explained that human myths were historical records. Admiral, with respect, you're still thinking like the old Coalition. You're thinking in terms of numbers and equipment and tactical advantages, but this isn't about numbers. This is about what humans do when people are depending on them. And what is that? Whatever needs to be done. 2 hours. Later, Jake Morrison's team was aboard a shuttle heading for New Geneva. But this time, they weren't alone. The new recruits were with them, young humans who had been trained in the old methods but were eager to learn the new ones. As they approached the planet, Jake addressed his expanded team. "Remember what we've learned," he said. "We're not just soldiers, we're not just humans. We're the inheritors of every legend our species has ever told. Every hero, every champion, every person who stood up when everyone else said it was impossible." The shuttle entered the planet's atmosphere, and the familiar sounds of battle reached their ears. But the humans weren't afraid. They were excited. They were about to add another chapter to the growing legend of human capability. Back on the Nexus Prime, Admiral Korvas watched the tactical display. The human team had been on the planet for 6 hours, and the impossible was happening again. The Void Swarm was retreating. "How do they do it?" Zarlin asked. "They're humans," the Admiral replied. "They don't know the meaning of impossible." The war continued, but now the galaxy knew the truth. When humans told stories about heroes, they weren't describing fantasies. They were describing possibilities. And in a universe full of impossible challenges, humans were the species that made the impossible routine.